So when should you seek therapy? Find out today on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Today we're going to be discussing when someone should seek therapy. So Liz, I'll pose the question to you. So when should people seek therapy generally?
I think a lot of times people wait a really long time before going to see a therapist. They could be struggling with an issue for more than a year before they seek out support for it. So I think it's kind of the same question of when should you see a doctor? Well, if you have a problem, then going to a therapist can help you with evaluating the seriousness of your condition, and it should give you some idea of different approaches for how it can be treated.
Which is fair enough. Obviously, if you're in an immediate crisis, you should seek help right away. But if you have an issue you're not concerned about, I think it's a good point that a therapist can help you dissect that and dive a little deeper into that. So, beyond determining when you should go to therapy, there are all sorts of types of therapists, and so it can, I think, be quite intimidating for the average person to find the right therapist. So how would you go about finding the right therapist?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on what your issue is. You want to find a therapist who has experience with dealing with the problem that you're facing. And you also want to know what kind of training they have specific to your issue. Something like depression or anxiety, those are really common issues that I think the majority of therapists are going to be pretty common at dealing with those issues. But if you're struggling with something like an addiction, you'd be better off seeking out a therapist that specializes in that area because they're going to have more knowledge of the risks and things like that. I remember when I was taking my psychopathologies class, we had an expert on addictions, and she said that depending on how long and how much someone's been drinking, if they stop drinking cold turkey, then the change from, drinking alcohol daily to not drinking any at all, it could cause something like a heart attack. So you want to make sure that the therapist you're going to really has a good understanding, especially with something like addictions, because there could be things that might not be as common knowledge.
Right, which specialization is important. I do also think it's important to mention credentials. You want somebody who's licensed. There are unregulated professions and areas where there are coaches. Anybody can actually be a coach, but to be a therapist you actually need to be licensed in a jurisdiction, and oftentimes, depending on your location, you can find on government websites or on whatever governing body oversees therapists, you can actually check if somebody has credentials and what they are. So that's another important note. Another thing that might be an important consideration is that different types of therapists can do different things. So a psychotherapist, Liz, like you're in process of becoming, a psychotherapist cannot actually diagnose problems, for example. Somebody could come to you with a whole host of problems, but your ability to diagnose somebody clinically, you would be unable to do that, whereas a psychologist, they can. And so it's an important distinction as well. If you're avoiding going to therapy because you're afraid that, they're going to just diagnose me with something and medicate me, well, it's important to understand the limitations of the type of professional you're seeing, because psychotherapists can neither prescribe medication nor diagnose. And so maybe if that's your situation, that could be a good option for you. Or if you actually think that you may have something serious, maybe a psychologist would then be a better choice. Or if you are a psychologist, while they can diagnose, they can't prescribe medicine. So then a psychiatrist, though, can prescribe medicine and can diagnose. So it's important to understand the limitations of each type of professional in determining a therapist. What are some other ways?
So understanding the way that the therapist provides therapy is really important, because there are some approaches like psychodynamic, which is a lot more geared towards insight. So when you go to therapy, you're trying to gain insight about your problem. There's other ones that are more action-oriented that focus on behavioral change and skill development. So you have to have some basic understanding of the difference in approaches in order to know what you're going to get out of therapy. I think a lot of times people can end up going to see a therapist and they don't have any expectations for it, and so they don't know whether or not the process is actually doing what it's intended to do.
Well, that's a fair point. So what are some things that could actually make therapy unproductive or would undermine that process?
So one of the things that I've heard a lot is that if goals in therapy are unclear, then that can really slow down the progress of therapy. You want to have a clear understanding of what your goals are. You want to have a measurable outcome, and you want to be focused on something that's in your control. So you might have a goal like, I want to feel better, but that doesn't focus on the aspects of your own behavior that can impact your emotions. And you have to get more focused on what you can control about that and how you can have an influence on that. Otherwise, you're not likely to start feeling better.
Well, that's a fair point. So making sure that you have goals that can actually be measured and realistic is absolutely critical to that. I think the other thing too is to keep in mind that in a lot of ways, seeking a therapist is a two-way relationship. So the therapist has to work for you, and you also have to be compatible with the therapist. So there are some other dynamics that go on there, like do you connect as people, or like if there's a big gap in, like, let's say age, that might also serve as a barrier. So there are a number of considerations as well, because some men, for example, might only be comfortable speaking about certain problems with men, or vice versa with women. So it's another important consideration to keep in mind.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research that shows that men are more ambivalent to seek therapy than women are. And there's also a lot more female therapists than there are male therapists. I'm really thankful that I've had the privilege of getting to work with about 50% men and 50% women in my internship. And I had a great experience doing that. It was a lot of fun. I didn't have any issues working with men. It was fantastic. They made a lot of progress. They appreciated it. And it was nice to see that it is possible to make that connection, even though there are some differences from the get-go.
Well, right. But the point being, though, that it is very much a two-way process. Your comfort with a variety of clients is great, but clients need to also understand that they have to be comfortable with you and be able to differentiate their comfort or discomfort with you from their comfort or discomfort of the process of therapy, because therapy isn't a very comfortable thing.
Yes, a lot of people can feel uncomfortable when they start therapy, and I amazingly was able to develop rapport with all of my clients. So it can be a tricky thing because you're not going to click with everybody, but sometimes you just have to give it a try out 1 or 2 sessions with someone and see if there's some rapport that develops, because it could just be a personality thing where there's something about the person that just doesn't feel right. And you have to be able to trust your therapist to be able to tell them whatever's on your mind, or it's going to really hinder the therapeutic process.
So as you speak of your experience in your current practice, what approaches or techniques or modalities do you use? So just to inform as to what your perspective is.
So I primarily use a cognitive behavioral approach. I find that a lot of the techniques are fairly easy to understand and implement, and they can help clients with getting some significant change in a relatively quick period of time. I think as well, talking with clients about how the problem is defined can be really important, because the way you define a problem is going to influence the solution you're looking for. So if you define it one way, there's going to be a certain set of solutions. If you define it another way, there's a different set of solutions. And usually when you can define a problem in a way that allows for a broader possibility of solutions, that on its own can be quite helpful for clients. As well, I try to always end sessions with something that the client can work on in between sessions, so that whatever we've discussed during the session, they can take into their daily life.
Well, and it also really maximizes the value of therapy, because you're not just working, an hour a week or however often the sessions are. But I think that's where we're going to have to wrap it up for today. But if you're enjoying our content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. We value each and every one of you, and we thank you all for your support. Until next time, remember that small steps can lead to big changes. We'll see you next time.